The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Karen Mitchell, a 45-year-old marketing executive from Ohio, clutching her camera with sweaty palms. This was her dream vacation to London, something she had saved for 3 years to afford. Karen had arrived at the palace gates 2 hours early, determined to get the perfect spot near the front. She pushed through crowds, ignoring dirty looks from other tourists, her loud American accent cutting through the polite British murmurs. "Excuse me, coming through," she announced repeatedly, stepping on toes and bumping into families with children. The ceremony was about to begin, and the famous red-coated guards marched into position with their tall black bearskin hats. Karen raised her phone, ready to capture every moment for her social media followers back home. She had already posted 12 stories that morning, bragging about her VIP experience at the palace. As the guards took their positions, Karen noticed she couldn't get a clear shot. A tall man in front of her was blocking her view, and she was growing increasingly frustrated. The crowd around her was respectfully quiet, watching the solemn ceremony with reverence. But Karen felt entitled to the perfect photo, especially after spending so much money on this trip. "This is ridiculous," she muttered loudly, causing several people to turn and stare. The guards began their precise movements, their boots clicking in perfect unison against the stone ground. Karen pushed forward slightly, trying to squeeze between two elderly British couples who had been waiting patiently for hours. The atmosphere was tense as Karen's behavior became more disruptive. She was talking loudly on her phone, describing the scene to someone back home, completely unaware of the disapproving looks from fellow tourists. The guards maintained their stoic expressions, trained to ignore all distractions during their ceremonial duties. Little did Karen know that her actions were being closely monitored by palace security, and her behavior was about to escalate into an international incident that would change her life forever. The ceremony continued with its traditional precision, but Karen's patience was wearing thin. She had been trying to get the perfect selfie with the guards in the background, but every attempt was ruined by someone's head or arm appearing in her shot. Her frustration grew as she watched other tourists seemingly getting better photos than her. "Move," she hissed at a young couple standing beside her. They looked shocked but didn't respond, which only made Karen angrier. She began pushing more aggressively, using her elbows to create space around her. The crowd was getting uncomfortable, but most people tried to ignore her behavior, not wanting to cause a scene during such a formal occasion. Karen pulled out her selfie stick, extending it high above the crowd. The metal rod nearly hit several people in the head, causing gasps and complaints. A palace security officer noticed the commotion and began making his way through the crowd toward her, but the dense pack of tourists made movement difficult. The guards were now performing their most important maneuver, a synchronized turn that required absolute precision. This was the moment Karen had been waiting for, the money shot for her Instagram. She pushed forward one more time, this time knocking over a small child who started crying. The child's mother glared at Karen with disgust. "It's just a stupid ceremony," Karen announced loudly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "These guys are just standing there doing nothing." Several British tourists audibly gasped at her disrespectful comment. The guards, despite their training, seemed to stiffen slightly at the insult. Karen raised her phone again, but this time she decided she needed to get even closer. The rope barrier separating tourists from the ceremonial area seemed like just another obstacle to her. She looked around quickly, making sure no security was watching, then ducked under the rope. She was now in the restricted area, just a few feet from the royal guards. The crowd behind her erupted in whispers and pointing. Camera phones turned toward Karen instead of the ceremony, sensing that something dramatic was about to happen. One of the guards, a young man named James who had been serving for 2 years, noticed Karen approaching from his peripheral vision. He remained perfectly still as his training demanded, but his jaw tightened slightly. Karen was now so close she could see the individual stitches on his red uniform. Karen stood just inches from guard James, her phone held high as she prepared to take her perfect selfie. She could smell the wool of his uniform and see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool London morning. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but she could sense his discomfort with her presence. "Smile," Karen commanded cheerfully, as if she were talking to a friend rather than a member of the Queen's Guard during an official ceremony. The absurdity of her request was lost on her completely. She snapped several photos, the camera flash going off repeatedly in James's face. The crowd behind the barriers was growing restless. Hundreds of people were now focused entirely on Karen's disruption rather than the ceremony itself. Children pointed while their parents shook their heads in embarrassment for her. Several people had started recording videos, sensing that this American tourist was about to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. Security officers were now pushing through the crowd with more urgency, but the sheer number of tourists made their progress slow. Karen remained oblivious to the approaching trouble, too focused on getting her social media content. "Come on, just one little smile," Karen persisted, waving her hand in front of James's face. The guards' training was being tested to its absolute limit. These men were selected for their ability to remain motionless and emotionless regardless of distractions, weather, or harassment. But Karen was pushing boundaries that few tourists had ever dared to cross. She reached out and tapped James on the shoulder. "Hey, I'm talking to you," she said with growing irritation. The crowd gasped collectively. Touching a royal guard during ceremony was not just disrespectful, it was potentially illegal. James's muscles tensed, but he maintained his position. His fellow guards could sense the situation escalating, but they too remained in formation. Years of training had prepared them for many scenarios, but dealing with an entitled tourist who wouldn't take no for an answer was testing their professionalism. Karen's entitlement reached a new level. She actually stepped directly in front of James, blocking his view and position. "I paid good money to see this ceremony," she announced to anyone within earshot. "The least you could do is cooperate for one picture." The morning air grew thick with tension as Karen raised her hand toward the guard's face, preparing to physically turn his head toward her camera. This was the moment when her vacation would transform from a pleasant trip into an international incident that would follow her for years to come. The slap echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Karen's hand had connected with guard James's cheek with shocking force, the sound so sharp and unexpected that it seemed to freeze time itself. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Absolute silence fell over the hundreds of tourists, guards, and palace staff. James's head had turned slightly from the impact, breaking his perfect posture for the first time in his 2-year career. His eyes widened in shock, not from pain, but from the sheer audacity of what had just happened. No one in the history of the palace could remember a tourist physically striking a royal guard during an official ceremony. Karen stood there with her hand still raised, her face showing a mixture of satisfaction and growing realization that she might have gone too far. The camera in her other hand continued recording, capturing her own shocked expression as the weight of her actions began to sink in. The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence. Parents covered their children's eyes. Elderly tourists looked horrified, and fellow Americans in the crowd felt deep embarrassment for their countrywoman's behavior. Even the pigeons seemed to have stopped cooing, as if the entire palace grounds were holding their breath. The other guards in formation remained perfectly still, but their eyes now tracked toward the incident. Their training had covered many scenarios, but this level of assault on a colleague during ceremony was unprecedented. James himself remained at his post, his cheek reddening from the slap, waiting for orders from his superiors. Palace security officers, who had been pushing through the crowd, suddenly found their path clearing as tourists stepped aside in shock. The lead officer, Sergeant Wilson, had served at the palace for 15 years and had never witnessed such blatant disrespect during a royal ceremony. Karen finally lowered her hand, looking around at the sea of horrified faces staring back at her. "He wouldn't cooperate for a simple photo," she said weakly, as if that justified her actions. Her voice seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in such circumstances. Camera phones were now all pointed at Karen, recording her growing panic as she realized the magnitude of what she had done. The ceremony had effectively stopped, with all attention focused on this unprecedented breach of protocol. Then, like a dam bursting, the consequences of her actions began to unfold with terrifying speed. Sergeant Wilson reached Karen within seconds, his radio crackling with urgent communications as backup units surrounded the area. "Madam, you need to come with us immediately," he said firmly, his voice cutting through Karen's growing panic. She looked around desperately, finally understanding that she was in serious trouble. "It was just a little slap," Karen protested as two officers flanked her. "He was being rude, ignoring me completely." The crowd murmured in disbelief at her continued lack of understanding. Several tourists were shaking their heads, some recording her arrest on their phones. The officers escorted Karen away from the ceremonial area, while James finally received permission to step out of formation. He was quickly surrounded by his superiors and medical personnel who needed to document the assault. His cheek bore a clear handprint, and photographs were taken as evidence. Within minutes, the incident had exploded across social media. Videos of Karen slapping the guard were being shared thousands of times, with hashtags like Karen slaps guard and Palace incident trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story within the hour, with headlines screaming about the American tourist who assaulted a royal guard. Karen was taken to a holding room within the palace while police were called. She sat in shocked silence, still, not fully comprehending the international incident she had created. Her phone had been confiscated, so she couldn't see the viral videos or read the thousands of comments condemning her behavior. The ceremony resumed after a 20-minute delay, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Tourists were subdued, many discussing what they had witnessed. James returned to his position with a visible mark on his face, becoming an instant symbol of professionalism under pressure. Back home in Ohio, Karen's family and friends were being contacted by news reporters. Her employer received dozens of calls and emails from people demanding action against their employee who had embarrassed America on the world stage. Her social media accounts, which she had been so eager to update with palace photos, were being flooded with negative comments. The legal implications began to unfold rapidly. Assault charges were being prepared, and immigration officials were considering her visa status. What had started as a dream vacation was turning into a nightmare that would follow Karen for years. The British media jumped on the story with particular enthusiasm, using it as an example of entitled tourist behavior. Karen's face was now known across the United Kingdom, and not in the way she had ever imagined when she planned her London adventure. The consequences came swiftly and severely. Karen was charged with assault, disorderly conduct, and interference with official duties. The British legal system moved quickly, and she found herself facing a magistrate within 48 hours, still wearing the same clothes from the day of the incident. Her court appearance was packed with media from around the world. Karen's lawyer, appointed by the American embassy, advised her to show genuine remorse, but her statement to the press outside the courthouse only made things worse. "I'm the real victim here," she declared. "I was just trying to enjoy my vacation, and that guard was being completely unprofessional." The video of her slapping guard James had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms. Internet users created memes, reaction videos, and satirical content about entitled tourists. Karen became the face of everything people disliked about disrespectful travelers. Her employer back in Ohio terminated her employment immediately, citing damage to the company's reputation. The marketing firm couldn't afford to be associated with someone who had become internationally notorious for such behavior. Karen's professional reputation was destroyed overnight. The financial impact was devastating. Legal fees, fines, and the cost of her extended stay in London while dealing with legal proceedings drained her savings. The vacation she had saved 3 years to afford had turned into a financial catastrophe that would take years to recover from. Guard James, meanwhile, became something of a folk hero. His professionalism in the face of unprecedented disrespect earned him commendations from his superiors and admiration from the public. He received thousands of letters of support from around the world, praising his dedication to duty. Karen eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and received a suspended sentence a hefty fine and a lifetime ban from all royal properties. She was also banned from the United Kingdom for 5 years. The judge's comments during sentencing were particularly harsh, emphasizing the disrespect shown to British traditions and institutions. Returning to Ohio, Karen found her life completely changed. Job prospects were limited, as her name was forever linked to the viral incident. Dating became difficult, as potential partners would recognize her from the infamous videos. She moved to a different state, trying to rebuild her life away from the constant reminders of her moment of entitlement. The incident became a case study in tourism schools and cultural sensitivity training programs. Guard James continued his service with distinction, while Karen spent years learning that actions have consequences and that 15 minutes of internet fame isn't always worth the price you pay for it. The slap that lasted seconds had created ripple effects that would impact her life for decades, serving as a permanent reminder that respect for local customs and basic human decency should never be optional, no matter how much you've paid for your vacation.